Damn it, not again. Who keeps dumping animals on my land? Eli Harper slammed the rusted barn door open with a scowl carved deep into his weathered face. The morning frost still clung to the dry grass, and the sun hadn't fully lifted above the hills behind his farmhouse. But he was already out, boots crunching over frozen dirt, shotgun slung over his shoulder, not for shooting, just habit, and anger simmering in his voice. For the third time that year, someone had crept onto his remote Montana property in the dead of night and left behind a mess they didn't want to deal with. But this time, it wasn't a litter of kittens or a starved raccoon. It was dogs. 3 of them, big, silent, and watching him. They sat just beyond the fence near his north pasture, perfectly still, as if they'd been waiting. No whining, no barking. Just eyes, sharp and unreadable, fixed on Eli like they were studying him, not the other way around. He slowed, something in his gut shifting from irritation to caution. These weren't strays, not in the usual sense. Their coats were clean, muscular builds. 2 German shepherds and 1 Belgian Malinois, each with cropped fur around their necks where collars used to be. What the hell, he muttered, lowering his hand to his belt, fingers brushing the old walkie clipped there out of habit. One of the shepherds rose to its feet, but not to run. It took a few steps forward, slow and deliberate, and sat again, like it was offering him a challenge. Eli crouched a few yards away, eyeing them carefully. "Where's your owner, huh? Someone dump you? Or did you walk out of hell on your own?" He glanced around. No vehicle tracks, no tire marks on the frost, no footprints other than the dogs. They'd either been here since before sunrise, or they came through the forest. But how they found this property, so deep and isolated, was a question he didn't have an answer to yet. He pulled his phone from his jacket and snapped a photo. Maybe someone in town would recognize them. Then he noticed something, barely visible under the thicker fur on the Malinois' shoulder. A faded tattoo, military ink, identification code. He squinted and cursed under his breath. "You're not pets," he said quietly. He whistled once, sharp and clear. The 3 dogs didn't flinch. Not one ear twitched. But the shepherd that had approached earlier slowly laid down, rested its head between its paws, and continued to watch him like a soldier waiting for orders. Eli's breath caught. It wasn't just the way they moved. It was the discipline. These dogs had been trained, conditioned, and then abandoned? Why? The question echoed louder in his mind than he liked. He stood, walked back to the barn, grabbed a bucket of clean water and some leftover venison from last night's stew, then carried it back to the fence line. He set the food down and stepped away. They didn't pounce on it, didn't fight over scraps. One by one, each dog moved in slowly, ate in silence, then returned to their same positions, eyes never fully leaving him. Eli rubbed the back of his neck, uneasy now. Someone had left these dogs on his land on purpose, and he had a sinking feeling it wasn't just because they were no longer wanted. Something told him this was the start of a storm, not a mistake, not coincidence, but a warning left in the form of 3 silent, waiting shadows, and their true story was about to shake everything he thought he knew. The morning sun climbed higher, but the frost didn't melt. Eli stood at the edge of the pasture, arms crossed, watching the 3 dogs as if they were a riddle he couldn't quite solve. They had finished the food without so much as a growl between them, and now sat in a perfect triangular formation, 2 German shepherds and the Belgian Malinois facing outward, guarding the space around them like sentries. It was almost military in precision, and that alone made Eli uneasy. He'd seen dogs like this before, back in his younger days, when he'd worked security on an overseas contract no one talked about in polite company. He remembered the way those animals moved, sharp, obedient, lethal if commanded. And what disturbed him more than anything now was the eerie silence. No barking, no whining, no fear, just patience. As the morning passed, Eli tried contacting local animal control, but the line rang out. Cell reception this far out in the valley was unreliable at best. He tried the sheriff's office. Nothing. Dead tone. His generator powered. Landline had worked just fine last night. Now it was nothing but static. He hung up and narrowed his eyes at the receiver. Coincidence? Maybe. But his gut said otherwise. By noon, he'd run out of questions and excuses. He stepped into the field, cautiously crossing the invisible line between them. The moment he reached 10 feet from the dogs, the Malinois stood, again, not aggressively, but with clear intent. The shepherds followed. Eli raised his hands, palms open. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said calmly, "but I need to know why you're here." It felt foolish, speaking to dogs like they could answer. But they didn't bolt, didn't challenge. Instead, the Malinois turned slowly and began walking toward the barn. The others followed. Eli stood still, stunned. "You're leading me?" he muttered. He followed. Inside the barn, shafts of dust-dappled light poured through the high windows. The dogs moved toward the back wall, stopping at an old storage cabinet he hadn't touched in months. The Malinois sat in front of it and pawed twice at the ground. Eli stepped forward, opened the door. Inside, among old lanterns and rusted tools, sat a single black duffel bag. It hadn't been there yesterday. He reached for it carefully, unzipped the top. Files, photos, a flash drive, a sidearm, standard issue military, cleaned and loaded. Eli's fingers ran over the top photo. 3 men, blurred faces standing in front of an armored vehicle, and between them, these same 3 dogs. His throat went dry. He flipped through the documents. Military log sheets, deployment records, and a discharge notice stamped in bold red. K9 Unit Zulu 9, terminated, unaccounted. He sat heavily on the workbench, the weight of the realization hitting him hard. These dogs weren't dumped. They weren't lost. They had escaped, and someone had hidden this evidence in his barn. He opened the flash drive on his old laptop, its fan whining to life. Inside, a folder labeled Phoenix. 1 click revealed video footage, grainy night vision, recordings from what looked like an underground facility, dogs in cages, training sessions that went too far, voices arguing in clipped, tense tones. One phrase repeated again and again in the logs, reprogrammed loyalty. Eli leaned back, his chest tightening. They weren't just soldiers, they were experiments. The barn's side door creaked. Instantly, all 3 dogs tensed. The shepherd closest to the entrance growled, a deep, chesty warning sound. Eli grabbed the duffel, shoved it behind the hay bales, and stepped toward the door. Then came the voice. "Mr. Harper," it called, smoothly. "No need for alarm. We're here for the animals." Eli opened the door just enough to see 2 men in dark jackets, no insignia, standing beside a black SUV parked just outside the fence. The SUV had no plates. The men wore mirrored sunglasses, despite the overcast sky. "They were left here by mistake," the man said. "They're very valuable, very dangerous if left unchecked. I'm sure you understand." Eli didn't respond. He glanced back. The dogs stood behind him, silent but alert, forming a protective half-circle. "These dogs trespassed," he said evenly. "I didn't invite them, and I didn't report them." The man's lips curved slightly. "Which is why we're here. If you just hand them over, no one has to get involved. You're a smart man. You know how quickly things can disappear." Eli's jaw tightened. "If they're dangerous, why didn't they attack me?" The man shrugged. "You haven't told them to." Eli shut the door in their faces. Inside, his hands were shaking. He turned to the dogs. "I don't know what you've been through," he whispered, "but I'm not handing you over to men who hide behind black glass and no names." The shepherd closest to him let out a soft, rumbling sound, almost like agreement. Eli reached into the cabinet, pulled the duffel back out. This wasn't over. Whoever those men were, they weren't government agents. They weren't animal control. They were cleaners, fixers, sent to erase mistakes. But these dogs weren't mistakes. They were survivors. And someone was about to learn what happened when you underestimated the loyalty of something you tried and failed to break. The sun had started its slow descent behind the hills, casting long shadows across Eli Harper's pasture. He stood just inside the barn, one hand resting on the edge of the cabinet where the duffel still lay unzipped, the other gripping a rusted crowbar he hadn't planned to use, but refused to set down. The dogs hadn't moved. They remained between him and the door, as still and quiet as ever, alert but waiting. The air outside had shifted. It was too calm, the way it gets right before a lightning strike, and Eli could feel it in his bones. Those men hadn't left. They were circling. He paced slowly, glancing out the cracked window overlooking the gravel path to the barn. The black SUV was gone, but fresh tire tracks and faint prints in the frost told him it hadn't gone far. Maybe a ridge above the tree line, maybe around. The back gate he hadn't locked in years. They were watching him now, assessing, planning, not just looking to retrieve dogs. They wanted to erase something. He returned to the duffel and pulled out the file folders again, flipping past the deployment records until he reached the final tab. A page labeled Emergency Protocol, Phase Out. There was a list of unit codes, dates of extraction, and one last column, disposition. Most of them were stamped terminated, but 3 were marked redacted, Zulu 9. All 3 dogs in his barn. He sat heavily on a bale of hay, the truth catching up with him. These dogs weren't just leftovers from a failed project. They were survivors someone had tried to erase quietly and failed. And now they were loose, unchipped, untrackable, and unpredictable to anyone except whoever had once trained them. That explained the silence, the eerie coordination, the way they had ignored his commands, but still responded to his presence. They weren't wild. They were waiting for orders, or maybe choosing who to trust. He heard it before he saw it. A soft rustle. Then the barn's side door creaked open an inch, and the shepherd nearest to it lunged forward, teeth bared, before Eli even stood. The door slammed shut again. Eli shouted, "Back off!" to whoever was outside, but the only answer was the crack of boots on gravel retreating fast into the trees. No gunfire, no shouts, just a strategic pullback. He turned toward the dogs. "They're not going to ask next time." The Malinois paced in a slow circle, then stopped in front of him and sat. It tilted its head slightly, eyes boring into his like it was waiting for something more than food or comfort. Eli swallowed hard. "You want me to fight back, don't you?" he muttered. "You didn't come here to hide. You came here to finish something." He picked up the flash drive again, holding it between his fingers. There were more files, he was sure. Whatever had leaked out so far was only a glimpse of the program's full horror. And it wasn't just about abuse, it was about intent. These dogs weren't just meant to serve. They were meant to be controlled, stripped of memory, of instinct, of identity. But Zulu 9 had resisted, and that made them dangerous. He opened his laptop again and plugged in the drive. New folders appeared this time, likely activated after detecting a familiar system. A series of surveillance logs appeared marked with dates and coordinates. One in particular stood out. Last week, less than 2 miles from his property. A redacted file with a voice memo. Eli clicked play. The voice was deep, clinical, tired. Subjects Zulu 9, Echo 12, and Tango 3 have evaded recovery efforts. Escaped through Section 6 perimeter. Handler terminated. Recommend immediate strike. Authorization if contact is made. They've retained too much. Protocol has failed. The dogs shifted. The Malinois let out a low whine, eyes locked on the screen like it recognized the voice. Eli stood slowly, rage simmering beneath the surface now. They wanted to wipe you out because you remembered, because something in you didn't let go of who you used to be. Outside another noise, a car engine, this time closer. Then silence. No doors slammed, no footsteps, just waiting. Eli picked up the duffel and unzipped the pocket containing the sidearm. He checked the chamber. Loaded. Standard issue, just like the ones he remembered from his time overseas. He wasn't looking to shoot anyone, but he'd be damned if someone came onto his land to drag away living beings like they were trash. The dogs lined up beside him at the barn door, side by side without a sound. Not a word had passed between them, yet they moved as one. Eli swallowed hard. These weren't just animals, they were brothers. He took a breath and opened the door wide. The pasture was empty. The trees stood still, but he knew they were out. There, he stepped forward, boots crunching frost, and raised his voice, not with fear, but with fire. "You want them?" he shouted. "Come and get them." Silence. Then a voice from the trees. Calm, flat. "This is bigger than you, Mr. Harper. Stand down." Eli didn't flinch. So were the people who trained them, but they didn't stand down either. And just like that, the Malinois moved, fast, silent, gone into the woods before Eli could blink. The shepherds followed, flanking, vanishing into the trees like ghosts. Eli stood there, heart pounding. A second later, a scream, then 2 gunshots, then silence again. And out of the trees came all 3 dogs, unhurt, eyes gleaming. They returned to his side, and this time, Eli didn't need to say a word. He just nodded, and they stayed. The night crept in slowly, draping Eli Harper's farm in a blanket of cold silence. The last streaks of light disappeared behind the hills, but Eli didn't head inside. He stood on the front porch, shotgun leaning against the post beside him, his eyes locked on the tree line where just an hour earlier the dogs had disappeared and returned like shadows on a mission. They were resting now, not in fear, not hiding, but close, stationed in quiet formation around the house. One by the barn, one near the back gate. the Malinois just a few feet from Eli's boots. It wasn't random. They were guarding him. He still hadn't processed everything, but he understood one thing clearly. These weren't strays. They were remnants of something the world wasn't supposed to know, something brutal, secret, and deeply broken. Whoever had designed them, trained them, or tried to erase them hadn't counted on one simple truth: dogs remember, especially when they're trained to forget. The flash drive, still warm from where it had been tucked in Eli's inner coat pocket, now sat on his kitchen table beside a map of the valley and a glass of untouched whiskey. He had watched the videos again, every last one, not because he wanted to, but because he needed to understand the level of cruelty, the depth of the operation, and the reasons why these dogs had ended up on his land, of all places. It wasn't a coincidence. One video, in particular, played over and over in his mind. It showed the dogs, these exact three, in a training room, chained and muzzled, while a handler barked commands through a speaker system. None of the dogs obeyed. They sat in silence, heads low but unbroken. Then the screen went dark and a line of text appeared. Subjects unrecoverable. Proceed with decommission. He had no idea how they'd escaped. No footage explained that. But they had survived. They had endured. And then, somehow, they'd found him. At first, he'd assumed it was random, that his isolated property had just been convenient. But now, as the pieces fell into place, he wasn't so sure. A soft thump pulled him from his thoughts. The Malinois had nudged open the screen door and stepped up onto the porch, tail still, eyes locked forward. Eli followed his gaze and froze. Red beam of light was slowly cutting through the fog across the field. A targeting laser. Just one, then another. Eli cursed under his breath and grabbed his rifle. He ducked inside, locked the front door, and sprinted to the window facing the road. Through the glass he saw them, 3 men, dressed in black, moving low through the field, trained, coordinated, armed. They weren't knocking this time. He ran to the back room, grabbed the duffel from the barn that he'd stashed by the cellar door, and returned to the porch. The dogs were already in motion. The Malinois bolted toward the barn without hesitation. One shepherd circled wide, disappearing behind the shed. The third stayed at the front, crouched low, watching the intruders close in. Eli knew he had to do more than just hold them off. If they were here now, they'd return again and again until the job was done. These people weren't going to stop because they failed once. They wanted silence, erasure. They didn't want the world to see what the government had buried in code names and black budgets. He ran to his truck, keys already in hand, and tossed the duffel into the passenger seat. Just as he started the engine, he saw a muzzle flash in the field, then another. He ducked low instinctively, heart hammering, as bullets struck the tailgate. But before the third shot rang out, a howl shattered the night, then a scream, then silence. The shepherd returned to the road, mouth stained with red, panting heavily, but unharmed. Eli opened the door. "Get in," he said. "All of you." It wasn't a command. It was a promise. The Malinois emerged first, limping slightly, but still steady. The second shepherd followed close behind. The truck bed filled quickly. As Eli climbed in and slammed the door shut, the first dog took the passenger seat and stared ahead, eyes sharp and steady. He drove, not fast, but not slow. The tires groaned against the frozen road as he wound through the back hills, heading, not toward town, but toward the abandoned ranger station an hour away. The place had sat empty for years, but it still had working radio equipment and, more importantly, a solar repeater that linked to the emergency network when everything else was down. It was their best chance to get the truth into the right hands. When they arrived, the sky was ink black, stars sharp and cruel above the treetops. Eli unlocked the old station, blew the dust off the controls, and powered up the system. The screen flickered to life. He plugged in the flash drive and activated the transmission. Files began to upload, slowly, painfully but steady. The truth was on its way. Behind him, the dogs sat in silence, one at each corner of the room, alert, guarding. A ping came through. The upload had reached 3 independent emergency response servers. A backup file was sent to a watchdog organization. No one could stop it now. Eli leaned back, shoulders sagging. It was done. He turned to the dogs, his voice rough but honest. "You're not ghosts. You're not tools. You're not theirs anymore." The Malinois stepped forward, pressed his head against Eli's hand, and for the first time since they'd appeared on his land, let out a soft, weary whine. Not fear, relief. And in that quiet cabin, buried in the woods far from anyone who might try to find them again, Eli Harper knew something with absolute certainty. These dogs had been created for war, but they had come home to heal. The first real warmth of spring crept across the mountains 2 weeks later. Snow had begun to retreat from the tree lines, and Eli Harper's farm, once buried under cold silence, slowly filled with bird song and thawing earth. The frost had melted from the fields. The tire tracks that once marked escape and pursuit had faded into mud and memory. But the change that lingered deepest wasn't in the land. It was in the air around the house, where 3 dogs now roamed freely, not as ghosts of something broken, but as protectors finally allowed to breathe. Eli stood on the porch that morning, with a fresh mug of black coffee, his usual shotgun nowhere in sight. He didn't need it anymore. Not since the night everything changed. The files had gone out, spread like fire. Within 72 hours, national headlines had erupted with questions no agency wanted to answer. Whistleblower watchdogs, animal rights groups, and investigative journalists picked up the scent. It had taken only one confirmation from a retired canine handler, followed by one redacted memo that leaked despite government pressure, for the rest of the world to finally believe what had happened behind those walls. Project Zulu 9, once buried in bureaucratic mud, had a face now. Actually, 3, and they were living quietly at the edge of Eli's pasture. The Malinois, now named Asher, lay under the old apple tree, head on his paws, tail flicking lightly as a breeze passed through. The 2 German shepherds, Boone and Ranger, patrolled the fence line every morning, and then dozed side by side in the shade of the barn, like brothers watching over something they never expected to find again. Peace. Eli sipped his coffee, eyes soft as he watched them. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected them to stay. The morning after the transmission, they could have vanished, and he wouldn't have stopped them. But instead, they curled up by the door like they'd been coming home all along. No orders, no leashes, just choice, as if some part of them still knew how to trust the right voice. He had built them beds in the barn but found them sleeping on his porch within days. He had stocked their food, but noticed they only ate after he sat nearby. And at night, when he sat in the old wooden chair under the porch light, they'd gather, silently at his feet, not watching the horizon, but simply being. One morning the sheriff came. He didn't wear his badge, just jeans and a clean shirt, hands steady as he stepped out of his truck and nodded toward the dogs. Boone stood immediately, but didn't bark. The sheriff froze anyway. "They look like soldiers," he said quietly. "They are," Eli replied. "Just not the kind you put in parades." The sheriff asked if Eli wanted to surrender them, now that the legal debates had begun. He said there were shelters willing to take them, even sanctuaries offering private protection in exchange for legal custody. But Eli just stared back at him. "You don't take family away just because it's complicated," he said. The sheriff had tipped his hat and left it at that. Later that week, a letter arrived. No return address, just a folded sheet of heavy paper. Inside, a single sentence handwritten in pen. "Thank you for keeping them alive when we couldn't." Eli didn't know who had sent it, but he suspected it was someone who had once worn the same uniform those dogs remembered. Someone who had watched them disappear and carried that weight in silence for years. He burned the letter in the stove that night, not out of secrecy, but respect. By the 3rd week, Asher had begun sleeping with his back to the door, not guarding it, just resting. Boone had taken to nosing open the barn every morning, walking the entire perimeter before returning for breakfast. And Ranger, quiet, solemn Ranger, had learned to play. He chased shadows across the field, tumbled into piles of hay, and once barked at a squirrel until he slipped on a wet patch of dirt and landed on his side with a grunt that sounded like a laugh. Eli sat in the grass that day and laughed too. The first time in months. He sometimes thought about how it all started. A single morning, a scowl on his face, 3 strange dogs staring at him like sentinels from another world. He had no idea what was waiting in the barn that day. No idea what it would cost or what it would restore. Now, when he looked at them, he didn't see test subjects or survivors. He saw names, personalities, choices. They weren't trained to follow. They chose to stay. That was something no collar or command could ever create. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the field in gold, Eli sat on the porch again, cup empty, heart full. The dogs were near him, not close enough to crowd, but close enough to know he wasn't alone. He looked out at the hills, where the last sliver of sun touched the grass, and finally said the thing he'd been thinking for weeks. "You're home." None of the dogs moved, but the quiet shift in the wind, the stillness in their bodies, told him they'd heard every word, and maybe, in their own way, they'd been waiting to hear it too.